So you are very, very welcome. This is the first webinar in our series. We have 3 already scheduled and we expect more later in the year. Today we're talking about good grant management, and then in May we're looking at organisational risk management, and in June organisational governance. This is part of the FFI Conservation Resilience Fund, which is funded by Arcadia. For those of you whose organisation are potentially going to be receiving other support under this grant, you may be familiar with the Organisational Resilience Check. This webinar is looking at 2 particular aspects of the Organisational Resilience Check, which is all about good funder relations and how to manage grants effectively, but also how to review funding agreements before you sign to make sure that you're happy that you can comply and to prevent problems in the future. We will cover today 4 things. We'll look at roles and responsibilities in grant management. We'll look at how to review a grant agreement before you sign, before you commit. We'll look specifically at procurement because this seems to be the biggest area of problems often, and compliance. And we'll also look at supporting documentation, what you need to keep, for how long, where and who has access. There is a handbook that we've created. We have it in English and we have it in French. Paula will put the link to both English and French in the chat. Unfortunately, we don't have it translated into other languages yet, but we're working on it. You will need to download this handbook because we're going to be working on a few exercises with it today. So if you wouldn't mind clicking on the link of English or French and downloading, it has much more information in it that we're going to cover today. So do have a read through in your own time. It includes a glossary. So if you're not a trained accountant, which most of us aren't, it talks about accountancy terms that auditors use that we might not understand. It has checklists, a checklist for when you start a grant, a checklist for when you close a grant. And it has things that might be useful, like a template for a vehicle logbook, how to monitor petrol use, and a sign-in sheet for meetings, these kind of things. While you're all downloading that, I just wanted to say a few words about who I was and why I'm talking to you about grant management. So my name is Dr. Chloe Hodgkinson. I'm the Head of Learning and Partner Development in Fauna and Flora International. I've worked in conservation for 20 years now. I started out in research in Central and East Africa. I handled some small research grants, but it wasn't until I started working for FFI about 12 years ago where I started handling much bigger grants. So things like EC, USAID, Jeff, US Fish, CPF, Arcadia, and also kind of private contracts with mining companies and oil palm companies. It was a very steep learning curve, and there were lots and lots of tight spots, lots and lots of quite tough moments in grant management, including a year-long audit of a project, a 5-year multi-million-pound project that I hadn't been involved in, that I needed to explain and justify to the auditor. So it made me very keen to improve how FFI managed its grants. When I moved to the capacity team, this was the first training that I wrote about 6 years ago, and we've trained hundreds of people now in grant management. We're trying to address what one auditor said to me was classic naivety about grant management. So understanding that we really have to take it seriously, and if we don't, it can get very expensive. So we're going to go now to Mentimeter. What happens if we get it wrong? You might have direct experience of this. It might just be a guess. But what happens if we get grant management wrong? Why is it important to take it seriously? Yeah, so they can return, they might ask for the money back. And here's the thing, they might ask for the money back after it's already been spent. So where does the money come from? Worst case, it could potentially close an organisation because you don't have the unrestricted funds to pay back. It could stop the project, absolutely. Almost every grant agreement has a clause saying the donor reserves the right to close the contract early. The objectives might not be reached. You waste time, yes. We don't have enough time and we don't have enough money anyway. But to waste time and waste resources and the stress is not nice to have. Absolutely. For a good project, you need to respect the procedures. You might have ineligible spending, yes. So procurement guidelines will talk about what kind of different things they can request. And it has an impact on the future funding for an organisation, I agree. When we run fundraising courses, we talk about hot, warm and cold donors. The best donors are the ones you already have. You want to keep them close. And they will potentially support you in the future. It's worth noting, when I worked in Liberia, there were 3 big statutory donors in Liberia. They met for coffee every month. So we knew if we did badly on one grant, the other 2 donors would know. So our reputation would spread. It wasn't just restricted to one donor, but there was potential it would spread. Okay, fantastic. Thank you. I think we'll get stuck into our first exercise, which is about roles and responsibilities in grant management. If you go to your handbook, I think it's page 11, you'll find this table. So on the left is a list of roles or responsibilities for one grant agreement. Have a think for one grant agreement that you're currently working on, which person leads on that, and then which person or which people support. If you don't know, if it's not clear, then just put a question mark in this 3rd column. I'm curious what you thought of that. I understand that some of you didn't get much time to look at the list, but hopefully you had some minutes. How did it go? What did you think? Was some things obvious, some things not so obvious?
I found that first of all, we also experienced some tasks that is quite common in Green Viet project. For example, we allocated who going to be manage the project and review all the condition and agreement, and then allocate and upload information in the on the Green Viet Google Driver for that project, so that we can store, we can get information. Anyone who come new to project can retrieve the information of project in one area. And then if we have changed and the chain in the contract have to ask the funder for agreement on paper. We also need to have a meeting, and we also allocate a communicator for the project. But we not have create a job, a full-time job for this position, and we recognize that it's important to have a grant manager position in the organization. But because in some small project we can't ask the donor to pay for that position, so normally we share for one person. Normally the director of Green Viet, he in charge for all the project that we want to follow and make sure that it goes smoothly. But because of his important position, he also spent a lot of time to another job. So normally he forgot the deadline of some meeting that he should be. And we try to be on time with the report, because the donor always remind with a nice email, say we want the report next 2 weeks or so. But from our side, we don't have like a people who are timekeeper to check the milestone of the project, so that we can prepare in advance. So that is some experience that we see.
Lots in there. Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you. So something in there about negotiating, something in there about you can't put too much on your CEO or your leader, because they have so many other things to remember, which is where I think this list can be helpful, to have those discussions. Whose responsibility is it to remember reporting dates? Who's going to write the report? And just be really clear about that to start with. I thought a very interesting point about the grant manager and who pays for their time. We absolutely have a tendency in FFI to focus budget on activities. I can see Debbie nodding, because every budget we see activity, 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 activity. Who supervises, who does the paperwork, who does the accounts? We now try and have a rule of thumb. Some donors like it more than others, but 50% should be about management. Organizations like the EC, they seem quite happy with that. They don't mind covering time, because they understand how bureaucratic their systems are and how much time it takes to get the right documents, the right reports, everything, boom, 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 boom. So I would definitely take care, if you look at your budgets and it's 80-90% activities, are you covering the time it needs to get grant management right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I would like to add on that we as a small organization and with less than 20 people, and this after the COVID, many projects is sinking down in terms of funding. So we have to save the money, but save the money in terms of management, to cut the position or to reduce time is kind of risk for the project.
Yes.
Because the activity is easy to organize on the ground, but the management, many people forget that prepare for a meeting is a lot of logistics going on. It needs agreement from the government, from security force, and that normally it takes time. And if there's no management plan, then normally the work will be delayed, and the delay is cost more, because then we have to again write a paper to ask for the permission.
Yeah, very wise words. Yeah. When you don't do yourself or your organization any favors by over promising and under delivering, for sure. Yeah. Thank you very much, Long. There may well be. In my experience, when we look at that list, there are things that several people are doing, like talking to the donor, or there are things that nobody knows who's leading on. I think it's really helpful to have those conversations early on about who is leading and who is supporting, and to make sure nothing is missed, but also to make sure that not lots of people are doing it. There could be lots of consequences, reputation, confusion, mixed messages. So good to have those conversations early. I would say every single organization and every team is different. It depends on workload, on skill set, on formal responsibilities. It doesn't matter necessarily who you choose. There's no set rule. It just means you should be clear and everybody knows that they have that responsibility. And one thing to note, Tupu very rightly said, this is a good thing to do when you start a grant, but equally, I think it's a very useful thing to keep revisiting. Maybe every 6 months, maybe every year, because people change, skills change, responsibilities change. Useful to just check in, email it round, make sure everybody's happy and that nothing has changed in the meantime. Things you might want to think about. If you do this for each grant, is there any roles that might need clarifying? Are there any responsibilities that you could include in job descriptions? And we deliberately provide you the workbook in Word so you can extract any of these checklists and potentially use them separately for different grants. So please do use it if you think it will be useful. Okay, we'll move on to grant agreement review. So you have to imagine you've worked incredibly hard writing a proposal. You are up till midnight. You went through all of the processes. You've answered questions. And they've said, yes, fantastic. The grant agreement has just arrived in your inbox. It's a long legal document. What kind of things are in there? What kind of things does it tell you? Does it guide you in? So either shout out or put in chat. What kind of things are contained in the grant agreement that you have to read and understand?
Yeah.
Right.
Normally when we discuss among the team and with the donor from the for the agreement, first of all, we check is the finance issue, because some donors have very specific discussion on grant, and also because it takes time from beginning of the idea of the proposal until it's been approved by the donor. So maybe in the team already have some change in terms of personnel, or so you have to allocate again people if one person move, and then have to update the information of the agreement. It's a little bit different to what you propose until the agreement. So we check that as well, because now we will step on after the sign, we will step on the implementation process. So we make sure that the team are already about that. And also we care about the donor for the communication, because they also put the communication on that legal document. So we don't want the communication task for the team is too heavy, because we cannot promise with them the thing that is more than what we can do. For example, they say make one video for 20 minutes about the project, and we don't have budget for that, or we don't have people to doing so. So we have to make sure about the communication, because some organizations put on very heavy pack of communication, and we don't have budget for that. Yeah, that's two things we want to review. Yeah,
fantastic. Yeah, so you haven't signed it yet. So if you need to make changes, if, for example, you wrote your proposal a year ago and something has changed, now is your chance to discuss and negotiate. But yes, communication. So in the chat, we also have reporting deadlines. Yes, when you need to get your report in. Restrictions of spending. Yes. What you can't purchase under the grant. There may well be a list of things you can't purchase. Often things like guns. Sometimes things like fertilizer. The US donors don't like fertilizer, for example. Grant milestones, communication rules and credit, yes. The things that you might want to take note of, accounting methods, how you keep your accounts. They may well tell you how they would prefer this. What equipment you can and can't buy, but also what you do with it when your project ends. What happens to that equipment? Staff appointments. If staff are hired specifically for that grant, they might have specific procedures for you to follow. They might want to approve staff appointments as well. Progress reports, when, what, if there's a template. Procurement guidelines, so this is purchasing goods or services, what you can and can't buy, what procurement threshold, what amount you have to start getting quotes or approval. What your funding is, what you can charge for overheads, your environment policy. Now that, if anyone's not familiar with that term, it's basically how much budget you can move between budget lines without applying for a no objection from the funder. So I think Darwin have 10%. Some donors have up to 50%. So it means if you have a vehicle purchase and a vehicle maintenance line, you bought a cheaper car, but you need to use that money instead to maintain it, you can use that money up to 10%, 20% of that line without having to get formal approval from the donor. So that's a useful thing to know. Supporting documentation. What do you need to prove you've spent the money in the way you said you've spent the money? And we'll come on to that a little bit later. Currency, what currency you'll receive the funds in, what you report in, whether you need to organise an external audit. We don't talk about audits today, we just don't have time. But in your workbook, there's a lot more detail on how to manage an audit and also a list of documents that auditors commonly ask for. So if you do find yourself in an audit, that's quite a useful resource. Bank accounts and interests. Yeah, so lots and lots of things contained in a grant agreement that you need to take account of. We find this quite a useful tool when we're reading through a grant agreement. So there's all of these things that you need to notice. We use a traffic light system. Which of these are green? So they're fine. We do that anyway. It fits perfectly. We just need to know. What are amber? They can't currently be met, but they're acceptable. But we might need to change our systems a little bit. And what's red? What can we not do? It doesn't meet with our values. It doesn't meet with our practices. We're going to have to negotiate that. We wrote a few points that we in FFI find we commonly have to negotiate. I'd be interested if you have any to add to this. But we often get asked to open bank accounts separately, one per grant. We find when we explain our accounting systems and how we can track grant funding, they're usually happy enough to let us put it all through our one bank account. We make sure that the funder sends the money up front and doesn't ask us to spend our money and then they pay us later. We also make sure that if there is an early termination clause, i.e. if the donor says we reserve the right to close this contract before the end date, that one, it's mutual. So we also have that right, but also that they will guarantee they will cover all expenditure up to that point. And then this last one about reporting dates, we often find that a project closes and then they ask us to report 2 or 4 weeks after closure. We all know in terms of processing timesheets, expenses, credit cards, it's actually quite hard to get all of those through the system and into a final financial report. Definitely not in 2 weeks, even 4 weeks is tricky. So often we go back and say, can we have 6 weeks for that? Is there anything anybody else has found they've negotiated that's come up previously in other grants or in the one you just read?
If no one else has got one, I can give another example. Shall I go ahead? So it was actually about the timesheets that Chloe mentioned. So we have a system of how we calculate the staff costs that go along with those. And a funder wanted us to use a different calculation method. Obviously, that would be in that red box of meaning that we had to change our systems too much, and we were able to demonstrate to them that our system was adequate for what they needed, and that other funders had also supported it and it had been audited, so we were able to negotiate that.
Yes, in our experience, we had a donor who kept on changing the contract. It was supposed to be a consultancy contract, and then at some point, they changed and asked us to pay the project costs, which they were supposed to be paying now from our money. Then at the third time, they wanted to change the agreement again so that it becomes an agreement, it becomes a project that would not only cover Kenya, but would cover the neighboring country, Uganda. So at that point, we had to now talk to the donor and tell them that we cannot do that.
I think that sounds very stressful for you, but I think it's a fantastic example of when you sometimes just have to walk away and say, no, this isn't feasible. And if we signed this and agreed to this, we'd just be creating a situation where we cannot deliver and there'll be stress and costs. So yeah, really good example. Thank you. But I'm sorry you had that difficult situation.
Thank you.
Just as a side note, it might be interesting to know, and there's more on this in your handbook. We're talking mainly about grant agreements. You might hear people refer to contracts. Under UK law, those are two very different things, and it's really important to know if what you're signing is a grant agreement or a contract. Usually we see contracts when we work with the private sector, so oil palm companies, for example. There are legal differences. One is tax implications. So you will have to pay tax usually on a contract, so important to budget for that. There's a few other things that are different. Have a look at the handbook, but I would always check with the donor, can you confirm if this is a grant agreement or a contract, because the law is different. So Martha's going to run 3 questions on procurement. And I want you to imagine you're buying camera traps for your project. Martha's going to launch the first question. And I want you to think about, so Martha, would you just introduce the question and explain what people have to do?
So on your screen on Zoom, you should see a poll that asks the question, is it okay to split a purchase in order to remain under a procurement threshold? So if your procurement threshold is $1,500 and you want to buy camera traps for $2,000, can you buy 2 chunks of $1,000 camera traps so that you don't have to abide by the procurement rules above the $1,500 limit? follow those specific rules. So we're seeing some results come in. We've got 9 people have voted. Anyone else want to jump in? Oh, wow. Okay. Give you just a couple more seconds and then I'll close it. All right. So we've got 17 votes and we have most of you, 76% of you said no, and a few of you said yes. So Chloe, what is the answer?
Okay, so most of you are absolutely right. Auditors are trained to sniff out this kind of thing. It's exactly the kind of thing they look for. So if there is a procurement threshold and you deliberately split one purchase into 2 to avoid having to get 3 quotes, for example, they will notice that and they will disallow that cost and you will have to pay back all of the money that you've already spent on camera traps because you've deliberately violated the contractual obligation. If it's a month apart, still the case, they will still ask why didn't you buy them together? If it's a year apart, it's fine. It's a replacement. I think that's valid, but just be careful of splitting. All right, I think Martha had the next question for you.
Right, so I'm going to launch the second one. You should see a question on your screen that says, do all 3 quotes need to be the same type of camera? So can you get one kind of brand camera for one quote, another for a second, and another for a third? Or do they all have to be the same type of camera? Is it like for like? Give you another little bit here. We've got 15 votes in. Y'all are awesome. Y'all are on this. Okay. I am going to go ahead and close the poll in a couple of seconds. All right. So we have 26 votes and 65% of you said yes, they do need to be the same type of camera. So Chloe, what is the answer?
Yeah, again, most of you are right. That's fantastic. This is a really tricky one, actually. I can give you an example of something we've seen in the past when a car was being purchased. 3 quotes were obtained, one for a Toyota, one for a Nissan, one for a Land Rover. They had to pay back the full cost of that car because they didn't get 3 quotes for the same thing. The auditors said you haven't followed procurement procedure and they lost $45,000 just because of that one thing. The auditor says you're just comparing apples to oranges. So how can you make sure you're getting good value for money? Because they cost different, because they're different things. So yes, it has to be for the same thing. If there is only one supplier for the thing you want and you simply cannot obtain any more quotes, you can go to the funder in advance and you can ask for permission to do single source procurement when you can only get 1 quote, but you absolutely have to get permission for that in advance. They won't say that's okay afterwards, and they will ask you to repay the money that's already been spent. When you get that permission, please file it somewhere central. If it's still in your email, when you get audited 7 years later and you've gone on to another job and somebody else is sitting trying to explain why you only have 1 quote, you will make their lives so much easier if you filed that. All of this kind of supporting documentation, any useful email somewhere central, either a hard copy in a filing cabinet or a soft copy on a central file server somewhere. Okay. Thanks, Martha. Last question.
This is a fun one. All right. So this last question is, do you always have to pick the cheapest quote? So you've gotten your 3 quotes. Do you have to go with the cheapest one? Is that always the right answer? We are quick on this one. Lots of votes coming in. Good. Give you just another few seconds to answer this for those who want to. All right. Great. So we have 69% of you said no, you don't have to go with the cheapest one. Chloe.
Yeah, again, fantastic, correct. You don't have to go with the cheapest one. There's lots of good sayings about this. Buy cheap, buy twice, or cheap is expensive, we heard earlier in the week. What you do have to do is justify your decision, and that can just be a few lines. We selected this quote because, and you keep that justification with the quotes in your central place. So again, in 7 years, if you're audited, everybody understands the reason. If you want to be super careful and reduce any risk, you can send those quotes with that justification to the funder and confirm that they're happy with that. That will reduce the risk to zero if they say, yes, that's fine. Good communication with your funder, I think, is absolutely essential for all of this stuff. If there's anything you're not sure about, just ask, just reach out and ask. That's their job. That's the grant manager's job. Okay, so you guys seem to know a lot of this stuff already, so we'll just whiz through. So yes, we're on procurement, aka what you buy and how you buy it, and that's goods, but it's also services, so consultancies, for example. Almost every grant agreement I've ever seen has very specific rules on this, and you may need to adapt your internal systems. So for example, you might have your office policy might be getting 3 quotes if you're over $2,000. If you get FFI's sub-grant and it's 1,500, you might need to adapt your internal systems. They are often complicated, but we cannot ignore them because this is the biggest source of risk in my experience. If you do not comply with the procurement guidelines, big costs can be disallowed. You can have to pay back the cost of a car of those camera traps in an instant because you didn't get that 3rd quote, for example. They will usually tell you where to buy equipment and services. This has been expensive for FFI in the past, again, due to what was called naivety. So there's something called rule of origin. US donors and EC are very, very keen on this. They give you the grant money and then they say you can only buy these goods from the EC. From the US, you have to purchase your goods from those countries. So for example, if you had an EC grant and you wanted to purchase a car, you couldn't buy a Toyota unless you asked for special permission because it's a Japanese car. You have to buy a car that's produced in the EC. Unless in advance you write to the funder and you say, we would like to buy a Toyota for these reasons. Can we please have a no objection? So you need to specifically ask for a no objection. When you get that email permission or that letter, where do you file it? You file it in the central file. I can't say this enough. And it's mainly because I personally have had to go through colleagues' emails from 10 years ago searching for permissions for correspondence. So please save it centrally. Restricted items, we mentioned a few, guns, fertilizer, it might tell you what you can't do. Advanced permissions, what do you need to ask for in advance? It might be about staff consultancy appointments sometimes. And then what supporting documentation you might need to keep. Does anybody want to take a bash at what supporting documentation might be required? What kind of things might you have in your file? What records might you need to keep? You can either put in the chat or just shout out. So we've got on the chat, we've got quotes from suppliers, absolutely. Procurement committee minutes, yes, if you have a procurement committee, which some donors ask you to create minutes from that meeting, yeah. Thanks, June. Anybody else?
Bon, pour moi, en tout cas, tout ce qui concerne l'achat, surtout les achats importants, tous les documents doivent être très bien gardés. ce que peut-être le bailleur a besoin ou bien l'auditeur a besoin, quand il te demande, tu déposes, c'est plus mieux.
Yeah, anything. Thanks, Tupu. So that starts with your receipts for sure. Receipts are the bedrock. They're your foundation, but it may be more than that.
Yes, I'm going to give an example of the supporting documentation. It's like when, the example, when we want to plan a new forest, is we want to buy many variety of seedling. It's like besides the quotation from the supplier, which is the technical documentation of the variety. And I think it's so important because beside the quotation, you need the technical document to improve seedling, and the variety is good enough for you to buy.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So the quotations aren't just to keep the donor happy, they're to make sure that you're getting good value for money as well. Yeah, so fantastic. So you may well already have a procurement process in your organization. We don't have time to go into it in detail. There's more in your handbook, but essentially it's, if you don't have one, it might be very helpful to create one. It basically just lays out for your staff what they have to do when they procure things. If you have a procurement threshold for quotes, for example, there's some things it might contain here, how to pay for things. If you have preferred suppliers, and who has to approve at what stage. It can be a really simple document, but it might be quite useful to create if you don't have one already. It helps make sure you're getting good value for money. It makes sure that you're complying with donor rules. It can make sure that roles are clear. If somebody is out the office, you know who else to ask, because that's what happens a lot in FFI. You're like, oh no, the person I normally speak to is on holiday for 3 weeks. Who do I speak to? We have our policy. You can go and you can check. It guards against fraud. And it also lets everybody know if you have preferred suppliers. So here we have patterns of spending for 2 different projects. Both are multi-year. So on the left, you can see the first few years, you've got increasing amounts of expenditure, and then the rest of the project is quite stable. On the right, every year you spend more and more and more, and the last year you spend the most. My question is, which one of these would cause concern or raise a red flag with an auditor? Which one do you think would worry them? Left or right? So put left or right in the chat. Okay, so we're getting, we've got a few left, we've got a few right actually. Does anybody want to explain? So it is actually the right hand one. Does anyone want to take a bash who thought right, why they thought that? Does anybody want to unmute?
From my experience, we always, I mean, most of the time, the most important action or the most, complex action in conservation projects are in the beginning, in the beginning years. So more or less, we start spending on the second, the third year, the most amount of money. We are working with wild species and reproduction centers and so on. So for us, it makes more sense to have in the beginning of middle of the project, the most complex action and the most expensive, and then slowly decrease the of money spent. That's our experience. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, spot on. So this would be the usual pattern. You buy your expensive capital items, your cars, your computers, you build the research station, whatever. There's another point to make here as well. And again, something that we've fallen foul of in the past. We all, I think, probably know that you can only spend grant money within the start and the end dates of the contract. That's for sure. What we learned the hard way is you can only use the things you have bought within the start and end dates. Can you hear me? So I'm going to give you an example of where we had to pay money back. We had a budget line for generator fuel for a partner, a government partner. We had lots of money left coming towards the end of the grant. So we bought 6 months worth of generator fuel a month before the grant closed. It was the right budget line. The donor had already agreed that that's what that budget line was going to be used for. We thought, fine, we've done a good job. Our partner will be able to use their generator for 6 months after the project's closed. Fantastic. The auditor disallowed those costs and made us pay them back. Again, we didn't have the money. The money had been spent. We had to find the money somewhere else because the generator fuel was going to be used outside the dates of the project. So again, just be careful that everything you purchase, you can justify that you will use for achieving the project objectives. They're strict. Okay, so the final thing we're going to talk about, and we've already touched on this, is just supporting documentation. I have a question for you. For a receipt to be valid, what information should it contain? When you get a receipt, when you write a receipt, what do you need to make sure is on it? We've got the date, absolutely. You usually have the date of when the item was purchased. We've got the amount, how much did you spend? Often the supplier's name. Yep. Yes. You might get a signature. That's interesting. Sometimes it has a formal stamp from the supplier to prove that it's official. You might get the address, yes, of the supplier. When I started running this course, I got much more interested in receipts, and it's always interesting to look at what information is on there. VAT number, yes. Phone numbers and address, absolutely. Yeah. So quite a lot of information to be contained in a tiny little bit of paper. One word of caution, try not to confuse an invoice with a receipt. An invoice is the intention to pay. It doesn't prove that you've paid. A receipt will confirm that payment has been made. Something that we've learned from experience, if you have to keep receipts for 7 years after the project closes, sometimes the quality of the ink isn't good and they fade. And you're presenting the auditor with thousands of dollars of receipts that are just blank. It's horrifying. So what we've learned to do is take photographs or scan. So we also have a soft copy on our computers of the original receipt. So if the receipt does fade and you can't read them, it's fine. We have copies where you can read them online. The other thing that we sometimes have is the receipts are in a language that the auditor doesn't speak. Again, that's fine. Auditors usually sit with Google Translate on their phone and translate them themselves. That's their responsibility. It's not yours to translate. And the third thing, which I'm sure you guys all know, is this: if you can't get a receipt, if you're buying dinner from a roadside cafe, they haven't got receipts, it's always helpful to just have a receipt book in your back pocket. And then you can write your own and just ask them to sign. So just to make the point that your office may look like this, I've seen piles of documents with a termite mound around them too. So just be careful if you have to keep them for a long time that they're stored somewhere dry, somewhere safe. So just the final point before we say goodbye is supporting documentation is more than receipts. I was told once by an auditor that we verify first and we trust later. You take a flight, how do I know you didn't go on holiday? How do I know you didn't get a refund and use the money for something else? The only thing that proves you are on an aeroplane is your boarding pass stub. That often needs to be kept to prove you're on the flight. If you have a meeting I'm sure all of you will have constantly be filling in, signing attendance sheets. That is to verify that the meeting took place and that you didn't just have a birthday party or something. There's this line about external better than internal. If you have a list of external signatures proving that event took place, the auditor will find it very difficult to ask for the money back. Photographs, reports, this is all good evidence, and I would keep all of it. It's not overkill, it's useful stuff. And create somewhere central. Any questions on that, or anything else that we've covered, or anything you want to discuss about grant management before we close? Now's your chance.
I have a question. Yeah. So you have long time to manage project and experience in many. How many projects there's a grant manager position that you have experience, and then for the small organization, the size is less than 30 people. How we can find the funding to support such important in our tight budgets? What's your suggestion for us?
I mean, because this time is being spent on grants, for me, it's about reflecting that in grant budgets. I'm being honest with the donor about that and saying we cannot successfully run this grant without this position, without this time being covered, and trying to have those honest conversations. Sometimes I think donors don't appreciate the time needed, and it's very helpful to have a meeting and explain it, and just be very honest. They might be surprised, but equally we can also say no if we think we simply cannot cover the costs of the time needed to run the grant. It might mean cutting back on the activities. In fact, it usually does. But it's about being open and using our experience on that, because I think there's such a tendency to under budget staff time. Yeah. Okay. Fab. We are out of time. Do stay on the line if you've got anything else to ask, but everybody who has to go, thank you so much. I know 2 hours is a long time to be listening, so I really appreciate your time, your energy, your enthusiasm, and I hope to see you at the next one. So take care of yourselves. Bye.
Bye, thanks.
Thank you, everyone.